notice good-looking guy standing next to me, you know that puts us in danger of finishing on time because he always has more to say than we have time to hear, but we want to spend more time listening than we put on the agenda, so we want to make sure we get all the time to hear whatever it is you're wanting to share with us. How many of you have ever heard of a little organization by the name of Orca Network?
All right.
How many of you get that little email update that provides us that little bit of burst of joy in your day?
Yeah.
So these are the two, Susan and Howie, that do that, and I think Lisa, well, is new to the team, but also doing that now. We thank you so much for giving us all a little bit of brightness in our day. But we really are excited about having Howie Garrett here to share with us things that he's been thinking about, trying to do some interpretation from what I tell.
Just lower the bar a little bit.
So he's made up a bunch of stories, and if you write them all down, you'd have a book. So somebody take dictation while Howie Garrett talks. Please join me in welcoming Howie.
Yeah, right.
And I'm not going to lower the bar for Howie. I won't go to the bar with Howie.
All right, well, thank you. Abundance of thank yous for Cindy and Jenny and everybody for being here. This is fantastic. So how many of you remember Monty Python? And now for something completely different. Maybe not totally. Actually, I think of this as more of a segue, more of a sort of a building on the work of the great ones. And a segue also from Giles' talk about refining the resolution of gathering behavioral data and all of that, sort of the grunt work, the field work, and the 40 years of field work that Ken has been doing out there that has gathered basically everything we know. The observations and documentation, the descriptions, everything has to come from the real world. And I'm going to sort of build on that a little bit. So this quote up here, without parallel outside humans, no parallel outside humans. That is astounding. I mean, really, when you think about it, here's the whole quote. Let's see, will this work? Yeah. I didn't make this up. But when you look at the implications, this is from a paper almost 15 years ago now. Rendell and Whitehood, two Canadian orca and general whale researchers, wrote this summing up all of the field data on every kind of whale that there was any data on, including even captive dolphin studies. And everywhere that they could find relevant information, they put it together in this 80-some page paper published by the Journal of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, top of the line in the UK. So it's a totally peer-reviewed, the state-of-the-art kind of a paper. And it said the sympatric groups of killer whales show the faculty for a culture that is without parallel except in humans. So really, when you think about that, what that means is that humans and orcas are up there with the capability of developing cultural lives, cultures, complete, intact, tradition-bound, long-term, multi-generational cultures like no other animal out there. Of course, it's not that clear. There are other sort of, gradations. Long-term pilot whales reportedly have similar cultures, but they're not nearly as well studied, and maybe not as elaborate, as complex, and as diverse around the world. So many different kinds, totally different types of cultures, different lifestyles, different everything. I mean, it's all been noted, but from diet to dialects, group size, family pattern, cohesion, long-term fidelity to family, and all of those parameters, even breaching frequency, a lot of the just little sort of innuendos, little items of their lifestyle vary according to their cultures. Even when they're side by side, overlapping, crossing paths all the time, they still maintain their distinctive cultures in each one. This is really pretty astounding. So what I'm going to do in the course of this, I've got an hour plus, so I'll be able to cover a lot, and is build on that and try to give you a new perspective that I would dare say is new to you, except for Cindy and Whitney, who are at the Seattle talk where I gave this a couple of weeks ago. It's changed though, it's new and different, so you'll see some differences. And give you a new perspective, a couple of new perspectives on that. And the way I look at it is this allows us to feel closer to the whales without having to physically get closer and closer. By understanding, by empathizing, by seeing a little bit about their daily lives, their struggles, their joys, their togetherness, their lives that goes a little deeper, that resonates with what we know about ourselves. Because we are like them, they are like us in a lot of ways. There's a lot of big differences, you know. I mean, that to me is also pretty fascinating, what's different. But anyway, okay, it's got a couple of sort of segments, parts to it, and we'll start out celebrating the new baby. I mean, you know, that's what it's all about. That's what pulls at us. Let's take care of that baby and all the others and the whole family. You know, that resonates right there. And what a gorgeous picture that is too. And this is sort of the actionable advocacy part of the program. And it's very repetitive from what you just heard because it's about the Snake River dams and basically the need for Chinook salmon. This is a graph that Ken put together out of, I don't know how many hours, days, or weeks of going through every kind of fish data up and down every river system from the Sacramento to southeast Alaska. And that's what, let's see if this will really work. There is yeah, these are the river systems, so they're color-coded to fit into this graph, so that you get the overall accumulated aggregation of all the fish year by year from 76 to 2014. And you'll note that this baby blue here is the Columbia River system. And the Snake River Basin is the largest producer of Chinook salmon of the Columbia River system, which is the largest basin on the west coast. So that's the predominant source, historically, of Chinook salmon. And so this starts in 1976, and I made a note here, Snake River dams completed over 15 years, ending in 75. So in 76, there were still a lot of salmon returning, and for the next several years. And then you note that bar gets thinner, it widens a little, and then thinner, and stays thin. And it's still thin, there's still fluctuations. But then when you note the aggregations correlate with these bars up here that note the deaths per year recorded of southern residents, yep. And you can see the deaths increase when the fish decrease. It's a correlation you can see. So this is a great visual tool for seeing what we're talking about, that these whales need Chinook. So I guess that's all I need to say about that.
Yeah, that on the handout back here.
Right? There is a handout, yeah, thank you. My agent has just reminded me. We have quite a few pieces of literature back there, including that graph and sort of a description of what it's all about. So basically the message is, this is the Snake River. Just for a visual on that, that's the Columbia where it branches off, and The 4 dams are between the Columbia and Lewiston, Idaho. And then upstream of that, for those lucky fish that make it that far, are 5,500 miles of tributaries that are salmon-producing tributaries. It used to be the breadbasket of the Pacific Ocean, basically the source for most of, or the greatest, basin for producing Chinook. And this is just a visual of the slack water. It's really the slack water that does most of the harm, that causes the mortalities of the little smolts that are trying to get to the ocean, but they don't actually swim to the ocean. They actually flow head first, or tail first, rather. So their head is oriented back to where they're going to remember to go to in a couple of years when they come back from the Pacific. But they don't flow because they're in these big reservoirs, and that's what kills them. They become subject to predators. Their whole timing of that metabolic shift from freshwater to saltwater is thrown off because they're delayed. So it's pretty devastating to the salmon. So this is, again, a repetition, 202-456-1111. That's the quick and easy way. Make that call daily. Keep in mind myself. And make these points. Orchids, salmon, taxpayers. I mean, it is an economic issue. We're wasting money maintaining dams that are not paying for themselves. And that equation is getting more and more costly every year. And best salmon producer ever. So now, on to the theoretical part of the talk. Abstract theoretical. Head games, in a way. This is purely about how we look at them, what we see when we see them. What are these critters? I mean, we all have theories. We live by models, by paradigms, by metaphors, by ways of understanding. And so we have our ideas. I mean, there's a whole variety of them here. And I'm going to try to sort of take it to another plateau. And this could be an alternate actual title to the talk, which is the title of an article in Smithsonian a couple of years ago by Seattle writer Lisa Stifler. And it's kind of interesting to me because it's understanding orchid culture, but it's saying learned behaviors that differ from pod to pod. And while, yeah, there are some differences in the dialects and a little difference of habitat use and behavior between the pods, the real crucial thing is between the communities, between the populations, between residents and transients and northerns and offshores. And those are the really big differences that science is grappling with right now to try to explain the diversity of these cultures. So the person who wrote the subheadline still needs to understand orchid cultures a little better. And then this, I think, really frames the question really pretty well. This was in Counterpunch, national, I think it is a print magazine as well as online. And it just came up in early October. The Tilikum effect and the downfall of SeaWorld. You notice he doesn't say the blackfish effect, it's the Tilikum effect. I mean, who did start this after all? And what he goes on to elaborate on is we don't talk about Tilikum anymore. He's forgotten. He's back there in the closet somewhere at SeaWorld, and nobody really reports on him or tells his story. And yet, he's the one who really got it going.
Right.
And he tries to explain that. And part of it is that in the movie, they interviewed the trainers and other talking heads and didn't really talk about him much. And so they sort of made him into a victim, into, okay, he's a tormented soul, maybe psychotic, and he struck out. And that's really all we hear about him. But what he is saying, I don't know this guy, Jason Reball, but I really like what he said, because he's saying agency is a historical phenomenon that is really not covered by the science that we understand now. That's free will. That's self-determination. That's freedom. That's creative behavior. That's doing your thing. You know, you know, you build those up, and that is your life story. That's why it's historical and biographical. And the biological disciplines just don't deal with it. And music to my ears, you need a historian or a sociologist to handle this. We'll get to that. So what I'm going to try to do is provide a quality picture. Whoops, okay. Jumped ahead a little bit. These buttons are way too close together. Provide a quality picture of the lives and labors of orcas in this case. For your entertainment, for you to consider at your leisure. It's really non-actionable, but it can reshape and sort of, I think, you know, elaborate on and deepen your experience of the orchids to understand some of this. But of course, another example, and the one I can't not talk about, of course, is Lolita in Miami. She's still an athlete. I don't know how she does that. She's been there for 45 years, and she still does this. This was last July. You know, she is incredible in a 20-foot deep tank to be able to do that. So her patience, her grace, her character, her strength is unfathomable to me. 45 years as a circus act where you can never leave the ring. And all you can see are walls. I mean, I don't know how she does it. This, just to dramatize it, but this is how she lives. And, you know, this would be pretty much how she spends 23 hours a day when there's not a show going on and her going through the routines in order to be fed, basically. I mean, they will feed her. They don't want her to die, but they hold the food back for each act, each trick that she does. There's a lot going on, and has been ever since the Tillicum effect went into effect. First, there was the petition. Actually, first it was a suit, and then followed by a petition, which was more effective, to NIFS to include Lolita as a member of her family under the Endangered Species Act that they were listed under in 2005. So that has finally wound its way, but in the meantime, there was also a suit against the USDA for permitting or licensing the seaquarium every year despite violations of the Animal Welfare Act. But that's all very toothless, and it was dismissed in court after appeal because the agency has a discretion to ignore their own regulations, apparently. And then when Lolita became a member of an endangered population, immediately we sued, and that means me and Orca Network as well as PETA and ALDF, and that's uncomfortable. We don't like suing at all. It seemed like it was important to get in there and add whatever momentum we could to that to make it happen. And my news of the day, which I just heard 2 days ago, is that finally there is a court date set for that ESA case in a federal court in Miami, which will be in May. I don't have an exact date. And there's a chance it could get pushed back, you know, by various delay tactics, but at least there is now a date set. So then we will try to prove in court that she is being harmed and harassed according to the language of the ESA, and that our solution, oh well, there's a whole lot of protesters making the case every week in front of this aquarium, and I'll get to our solution to this in just a moment. It's that. This is really where it's all pointing toward, is the proposal to relocate her to, that's on the web. It's about 40 pages with appendices all over the place, so a lot of detail on it. And it's all about this place, which is in East Sound, Orcas Island, a perfect little cove set aside, no tidal action except vertically. I mean, and it's the owner is enthusiastic about it and is able to help in a whole lot of different ways, and so it's really a perfect location for her. And this is what it looks like from the shore side. So it's really nice. It's just, we couldn't ask for a better place to relocate her to. Well, you can read the whole plan, how it sort of is spelled out, and the essence of it really is it depends on her. I mean, once she's there, and there has to be the very gradual transition to living there and to new people, new companions, and you know, but as much continuity as possible to make that transition, you know, with their current trainers, veterinary staff, to you know, ease the stress of the change, you know, as much as possible, but in the assumption that her home waters in her own backyard are therapeutic, are going to help relieve a lot of the stresses and anxieties that she has to be medicated for now. That although she doesn't show signs of particular stress, and she is not known to have struck out, to have bit or dragged anybody around, or you know, a few gestures sometimes are known, but nothing drastic. But another case that was on that previous slide was that OSHA did cite the seaquarium in the same way they cited SeaWorld, that they were endangering their trainers by letting them in the water, making them get in the water with her. And OSHA won. They at first appealed, and then they dropped their appeal because that would have forced a hearing that would have been a huge public spectacle, and that was what happened with SeaWorld, and we know how that turned out. So they decided, okay, we'll drop it, so there are no more trainers in the water with her anymore. But we do know from some inside sources that she very often vocalizes in L-pod calls through the air, which makes me wonder, and this is pure speculation, but she may not know she's 4,000 miles away. She may think that she's still at the Seattle waterfront. She can hear ocean water, Biscayne Bay, but she may not know she's that far away. She may think that she may get an answer. 45 years. But she still calls, so she knows who she is. She knows.
Didn't
Yes.
someone go with recordings from the local pod and play them to her?
We did.
Okay.
Well, we didn't. Dateline NBC played a recording that Ken had made in 1995. And yeah, she responded. She came halfway out of the water, but that was not authorized, and they would not authorize such a thing, and they don't want to talk about that connection. Now they do, though. I will say, it's sort of an aside, but now that there's no trainers in the water, what a boring show it is. Yeah. So they fill up that time with about a 15-minute diatribe about how our plan is terrible. I mean, they really are arguing with us in front of their public, which informs them that there is a debate going on, and probably bores them to tears because, you know, what do they care about this? And it's all in, you know, language of pathogens and endangered status, and, you know, it's amazing that they're doing that, but, you know, I'm not quite sure why. It seems like they should just keep to the circus as much as possible, but they're engaging in the debate with us. Yes, Jenny?
Kelly, is some of that change coming with the new ownership? I thought I remember that they have new
Oh, there is a new ownership. Well, yeah, and that's a good point. I did want to mention that part of the problem right now, even though there are some very powerful, very well-connected and wealthy people who really want to help in every way they can, the problem is finding out who's in charge. There is new ownership, and the ultimate owners right now are an investment group in the UK that owns Parcos Reunidos, which owns, I think, 70 marine parks, including Marineland Antibes, so they own orcas in France. And they own Palace Entertainment, which is a US-based company that has about 40 theme parks, water slides and, you know, recreation places. And that whole conglomerate, Parcos owning Palace, which owns this aquarium, is on the block and is supposedly going to be sold by December 20th of this year. So it's in flux. And who's in charge? Who do you talk to? Who's the boss? So it's really difficult to locate, who's the right one. We've reached out to who we thought was probably the right one, the CEO of Palace Entertainment, who I presume would pass that around to whoever is in charge. But anyway, it's a very ambiguous situation right now with knowing who to talk to negotiate with. But times are a-changin'. This is another way to measure the Tillicum effect, which is that SeaWorld is in the dumpster. They just closed Friday below that red line on the bottom. Their stock will not likely come up, and in fact, Bank of America and Merrill Lynch have just recommended a do not buy on SeaWorld stock, that they're not going to get out of this. So that really does change the landscape. They're obviously, the big behemoth of the industry around the world, and they're trying to expand to Asia right now and the Mideast. And so the more that we can make it really plain that the public does not want what they have, which is captive orcas on display, the harder it's going to be for them to expand. And so, the more dramatic and the quicker we can do that, the better. And it's moving right along. Yes?
Just whereabouts on that chart was like the CNN airing of Blackfish?
The CNN airing was in early 2013. And they were still on a high at that point. But the August 13th date, 2014, was when they announced their previous quarterly losses, essentially. They'd lost attendance, they'd lost revenue, their profits went down 84%. They're steeply discounting their tickets to get people in the seats. So their attendance doesn't look, it's down, but only, a fraction. But their revenues are way down. They're deep in debt. They need it to be, their stock at about the 29 to 30 level to pay off their debts, to service their debts. So there's got to be some serious rethinking going on at headquarters. They have a new CEO, but they have the old guard. The vice presidents and all that have been there for decades and gotten away with it all these years and been incredibly arrogant and dismissive and hostile, basically, are now going to have to say, never mind, or they're going to have to leave. Is there a question?
So they've announced that they're phasing out San Diego anyway, the Orca show, and they're gonna go to a natural habitat show. What is that?
Show. Okay, right, show. Yeah, the operative word is show in both cases. Yeah, they did announce a couple of weeks ago that at the San Diego park at least, they are going to change the format of the shows from being the circus act with all the glitz and glitter and loud music and everything to something, and they don't really define what they mean. It will be a naturalistic experience. They're weaving in words like conservation and education. And so that really kind of remains to be seen what they're going to do with all that. But it won't materially change that the whales are still in concrete boxes, and they have not said anything about ending the breeding of them. That would be the first genuine step that they're making a transition, is when they say, okay, we're going to stop breeding, meaning they can see that, the end is in sight for their whole business model. John?
In the case of Lolita, do you have any idea how much money they think Lolita is worth as an asset? And if they lost Lolita, would they go out of business, or do they have enough other, I don't know anything about Seaquarium.
Right, no, she is their Elvis, as we used to say. So without her, they tried about 8 or 10 years ago to build a $5 million dolphin petting pool and publicize that. And I don't think that's really taken off and has not made up for her as a draw. I mean, it's just a little roadside attraction, so it's not a big audience, but they do still, I don't know if they filled the stadium. There's a lot of empty places in the parking lot every weekend.
Do you have any idea what they think she's worth?
What she's worth, no, I mean, I know, that would be pure speculation. I don't, I mean, that is changing, I can tell you that, because they're not as valuable as they used to be already, I'd say, because she's getting to be more of a liability. I mean, whales are pretty expensive to maintain in captivity, and if you're not, making lots of buckets at the gate, you start to less than break even. So, I don't know, I think that's a real shifting price. So, yeah, anyway, SeaWorld, and this is, if you really want to get the full expose of how SeaWorld works from the inside, it's kind of like Scientology. And John Hargrove has now escaped and is telling all. I mean, and it's completely accurate, but it's also very heartfelt, because he was a dedicated SeaWorld spokesperson for 14 years that he was a head trainer. So it's a really good book, and it just got optioned to become a movie. So we may see that very soon. And this is my breaking news of the day. This is a paper that Ingrid Visser and Matt Spiegel, who is an attorney, have been working on for a long time about Morgan, the whale that was rescued and then sold basically from the Netherlands and is now at Royal Parque in Spain and Canary Islands. Because of all the laundering, basically, all of the duplicity of the reporting, the failure to observe the CITES laws, the European Union laws, the laws of the Netherlands, the laws of Spain. SeaWorld claims Morgan as one of their assets on the Securities and Exchange Commission papers, but they don't on their public pronouncements or to their stockholders. So, which is it? So it's sort of a long continuation. Ken and I and many others saw a lot of that back when Keiko was the big issue, and how did he get to Canada, and then how did he get to Mexico? There was a lot of whale laundering going on then, a lot of sort of shady deals and non-reporting. So they're finding that still going on. So it's their MO continues, and that they've been working on it for I think about a year, and literally it's been embargoed for 1 week while the CITES officials and other government people looked at this paper, and Ingrid said we can make it public today. So you're the first ones to see this. I've got it, by the way. If anyone would like the whole paper, I can email it to you. Just let me know. So now, about those whales. Let's look at some of the basic natural history of orchids. Just sort of some baseline understandings to set up where we're going here. One is, of course, their brains. They're huge. About 4 times the size of human brains. That's got to count for something. We don't know what they're doing with all that brain power, but it ain't nothing. And they've got the equipment, the convolutions, the gyrifications, the hemispheres. They've even got this mysterious paralimbic lobe that somehow spans the right and left hemispheres and may integrate senses with empathy. It's just a guess because we don't even have one to be able to know what it does. But anyway, they're fully equipped with plenty of brain power. And their evolutionary history. It goes way back. They are apparently, at least among, if not the first of the dolphins. And certainly in short order, and this goes back, let's see, there's our Orcinus orca, and it says 8.3 million years that they have been presumably in their current form and probably their current roughly size, or at least many millions of years ago, the way we see them today. So that's a long, long time, and in all that time, they have been the apex predator of the ocean. So that gives them a lot of opportunity to create these cultures without having the kind of fight or flight, fear response that our ancestors certainly had to live with. You know, there are a lot of, big saber-toothed cats and vicious dogs and all kinds of things were out there in, our evolutionary history, which doesn't even go back that far. So we've had a lot of cowering from nature, running from and fighting back that they haven't had to bother with. Nothing touches an orca and gets away with it, So they've been able to have the luxury of a calm mind, to be able to devise their ways of life, without distraction, without adrenaline pumping every, half hour because of some threat. They really don't have any immediate threats, or haven't historically. Of course, humans create threats where they don't need to, but that's in the very recent history. But their whole long evolutionary history has been without the fight or flight response. So that's allowed them a lot of leeway. So now let's just sort of look at what we see today, the orca cultures. And since that paper, that 2001 paper, Culture in Whales and Dolphins, and before that too, but especially since there have been a lot of field studies around the world. It's really, it obviously started here with Mike Bigg and then Ken, and this is still the best studied population of any whales anywhere in the world. And the baseline, but what was learned here about residents and transients 15 years ago was thought, or maybe 20 years ago, thought to be the pattern around the world. You'll find residents and transients. And then, of course, somebody found offshores. But then the more they looked around, the more researchers got into the field and did the photo ID and started to get the outlines of the different populations around the world. They're different. They don't necessarily restrict to only eating mammals or only eating fish. Some eat both. Some have a little wider diet, but they all have limits. They all have some prey preferences that they observe. There are quite a few universals, and that's one of them, but there are all these cultures around the world. So I'm just going to do a quick survey of the cultures, and you know them all well. We'll start with our friendly local neighborhood, southern residents. And I say 83 because I include Toki in Miami.
Yay.
Yeah.
And of course, northern residents. And this is, my best, most recent information. There may be updates since then, but that's how I understand it. And then, of course, transients, and Alaska to California. And I'm sure everybody in the room knows all this, but we shouldn't just take it for granted. For one thing, there isn't anywhere else on the planet where there are residents and transients in a well-populated area accessible for viewing year-round. We have some residents coming up Puget Sound, let's see, where were they last? Off Restoration Point, Bainbridge Island? Okay, right, Richmond? Yeah, Kingston, Edmonds, coming this way. Do we have a count? Maybe a couple of dozen. Anyway, we have at least one tentative ID of L88 from one photo, so anyway. And transients, and the other report was possible transients that were yesterday in Saratoga Passage on the east side of Whidbey. Maybe they went out Deception Pass because they were at West Beach on the north side, the Salish Sea side of Whidbey this morning. So this is a daily occurrence. We have these transient, mammal-eating, completely different than residents that we also have. And they're, what now? That's 20 miles apart. they sometimes get within a mile or two. So, I mean, this is really something that is astounding. I mean, we shouldn't just take this for granted. It is really, really amazing. I don't think there's anywhere else on Earth that has this kind of proximity of two completely different cultures. And then, of course, there's the offshores that are not that far away. So this is just sort of the eastern Pacific coast rundown, and this is from the U.S. Pacific Marine Mammal Stock Assessments 2012. I don't consider this the last word. This is sort of a work in progress to try to delineate the different communities. I don't see California transients on there, for instance, so I don't know, maybe they are considered part of the West Coast transients by some accounts, or maybe not, I don't know. But at least, that gives you a sort of a rundown, a sketch of the different cultures that are not that far away, that are just right off our coast. And then, of course, if you look around the world, this great illustration by Yuko Gorder really spells out all these different cultures around the world. And I've plugged in their dietary preferences and some of their habitat preferences just to sort of give you a sense of how different they are. But there's at least 4 different types around the Antarctic. It sounds like from the way they break down there may be more. There's 2 kinds of type Bs, for instance, large and small, So these are still preliminary results. And they've got all these different types. And these are known as ecotypes for the most part. But it should be noted that Bob Pittman wrote that the word ecotypes is really a placeholder for work in progress. Because ecotype refers to ecosystems, which really gives you the impression, the word sort of says, that it depends on the ecosystem what type is going to appear. And we'll get to that, because that's sort of a preliminary assumption, but there could be more to this than that. So it's been a really hot topic whether there are more than one species. How do we break them down? Are they all Orcinus orca, which they are still now, since Linnaeus of 1752 it was, or something to that effect. But there's all these different types, and there's no interbreeding over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. Even though they cross paths and are fully capable of interbreeding, they don't. So that's a real cultural rule that keeps it that way. So there's long-term fidelity to the rules, you could say. So there is an indication of multiple species, and this came out several years ago. But it's not the consensus. I mean, I don't know, it's not the unanimous opinion, I should say, because Lance Leonard and Kathy Heiss, for instance, say, well, let's just continue to look at them as one big species complex, or complex species. But the question really all along that the Ecological community is grappling with, I'll get to that. Well, it's the diversity. How can there be this cultural diversity? We don't see that in any other mammal. You don't have, for instance, a population of bears that eats only rodents and another that eats only blackberries that could interbreed but don't, and that cross paths all the time and speak different languages. So, this is really unheard of in biology, to have this kind of cultural diversity. So that's a huge question. Okay, now I am going to have to get a little bit autobiographical here, because it's not that it's relevant or interesting, but it's because I'm going to try to weave in a whole different perspective, a whole new way of looking at orcas that I dare say you probably have not heard before, and if you have, I'd love to talk to you. But I got it there. basically, at UC Berkeley. Actually, I started 2 years before I got there at University of New Mexico. And as a, suburban kid, wandering around a big school and not knowing what I was going to do, I figured I'd better take the easiest possible course. So I made my major sociology. I thought maybe that way I won't flunk out. That was pretty much my standard of achievement. So I, and I seemed to pass the tests, and so got into my third year and found myself at Berkeley because Ken and our brother Rick were in Berkeley, and so I had a place to stay. So I transferred to Berkeley, and the first class I took was with this guy, Herbert Bloomer, who, of course, I didn't plan this or know this, but he was the writer, the illustrator, describer, interpreter of this theory of symbolic interactionism, which is within sociology. And he was just as gruff and mean and intimidating as he looks right there. And this was his last class. I really lucked out. He retired at the end of our class. But the principles are really pretty simple. And actually, it's kind of intuitive. We talk about the whales kind of in these terms as sort of persons that, have these kinds of thoughts and values. But, what I want to do is try to kind of contrast that understanding with the literature, with the body of scientific knowledge that is sort of the foundation for what's acceptable to say in polite society, because it's not there. I'll get into that a little bit. But anyway, symbolic interactionism, the whole perspective, the whole idea of it is that we act toward things on the basis of the meanings that things have for us. In other words, not stimulus response, not instinct, not even unconscious conditioning or habituation, but it's what things mean that determines how we act toward them, how we address them.
Is that your quote?
No, this is right out of the book. Sorry, these are sort of the simplified, basics. And those meanings that we, use to know what to do about things derive from social interactions one has with others. So they are derived socially. And by things, by the way, that means everything, not just objects and not even just animals and plants, but others, people. Just to sort of simplify it and make it into an objective science. Everything is reduced to being a thing. So that's sort of how that theory develops. And here's where the freedom comes in, the agency, the will to do whatever you want. These meanings become modified through an interpretive process. So, we can choose how to respond or how to redefine the meanings of things so that we can then create a new response or innovate, change things. And Bloomer contrasted that with the behaviorist explanations of human behavior, which does not allow for interpretation between stimulus and response. Now, of course, for symbolic interactionists, there is no parallel outside humans, period. Orcas never even thought of, and of course, that was way before there was much of any field work about orcas to go by anyway. But still to this day that I know of, I'm not in that world, I'm not in a university setting, I don't read the journals, I'm not, maybe there's somebody speaking up that says, this is interesting, this parallel with orcas, but I haven't heard of that. I'd love to, but I haven't heard of it. So I think there's this kind of insulation of sociology from cetology and vice versa. There really isn't any cross-fertilization or synthesis going on. So this is the way symbolic interactionism talks about why we can do this. And I've used this great photo by Jeff Hogan, where that little guy looks like he's winking at you? This is why we have highly developed brains. Check. We rely heavily on society. True of both, orcas and humans. More so than our sort of Western civilization notions of rugged individualism and freedom at all cost and sense of self-determination and self-made and all that. We rely on society every move we make all the time, constantly, and so do they. And we are able to make many subtle and sophisticated sounds. Check. Got that. They certainly do. Pretty much explained, undiscussed, except to compare, the dialects and get some parameters. But what they mean, what they do, is not a topic in the literature, in the science. Meanings are not a word that scientists, cetologists are using. And this is a more current, sort of a required reading textbook in Sociology 101 today, that humans are social, humans are thinking, humans don't sense their environment directly. And, I think that's oversimplified. Sometimes we do, and, a rock is a rock, everybody can see a rock. But it depends on how we define it. A tree to a logger is bored feet. To a hiker, it's a place to sit and rest. To an ecologist, it's an indication of forest health. How you define a thing is how you see it and what you see in it to a great extent. And, you could apply that to orcas. I would have to assume that a Chinook means a different thing to a resident than it does to a transient, and a seal vice versa. They see more into them, they're much more interested. And this is another 101 required reading book, just that the title itself sort of emphasizes the social construction of reality. You sort of build your concepts, your beliefs, your understandings, your traditions, your attitudes toward in interactions as you grow up in your society and interact daily all the time. So that's sort of what that tells us. So then, in the early 80s, Ken came by and we had lunch in Colorado, and he said, "You want to come out and help out with the Orca survey?" And I said, "Okay." So, and that, I had a 17-year college career, but I did get my degree. I honestly did.
Been 14 years.
But I had just gotten it when I had lunch with Ken. And a couple of months later, I come out to San Juan Island and start living at that house. And that was early 80s, and that was just about a half a dozen years after the very start of the field work. Mike Bigg, Ken, John Ford, those pioneers in the field that really began to delineate the outlines of residents and transients and northerns, and John doing all of that acoustic work on dialects and differences between populations, sort of emphasizing the difference between pods, not so much the total differences between communities, which I think is more fascinating. But I was suddenly in the hotbed of this blooming new science of orcas, new to the planet. Nobody knew these things at all before, a half a dozen years before I happened to land in the middle of it. And I was fresh from a year at Colorado College talking in these seminar settings all about symbolic interactionism, to get my degree. And I come out there and I'm hearing all this and I'm thinking, wait a minute here. It sure looks like maybe those guys are doing what I just heard about in that seminar class that I just took. But, that was so unheard of and unthinkable that there was no way to sort of talk about that with anybody. So I just, corked it and and watched and listened and tried to do reality checks, tried to, you know, for years, tried to think of, okay, you know, can that really be the case? Can sociology be wrong that there's no other species that can do this? And, you know, can they really guide their lives by the meanings of things that they derive from their social interactions and, you know, live their lives according to the traditions and rules of behavior that are passed down over the generations, just like we do? Well, it seems like it. That's, of course, Isis, Dave Ellifrit's dog. So, back to the paper. This is what it says, that orcas have no parallel outside humans. But this is what it also says, and this is the limitations, the ceiling of this paper, beyond which still Scientology has not gone. And they say empirical science is great because you're really supposed to spell out what you know, what you don't know, what you're saying, what you're not saying, and lay it out all on the table, and they do that. They say that, you know, understanding process, the transmission, is crucial to understanding cultures, but no attempt is made here to even begin to find out how they spread their cultures, how they transmit over generations or horizontally from whale to whale. We don't know that interaction process at all, and we ain't going to go there. We know nothing about the learning mechanisms that cetaceans employ. They make it very, very clear. But then they offer this tantalizing hint. They say human culture is intimately linked to both language and symbolism, but there's currently no basis for even talking about whether orcas do that. So that's their limit. That's just what they say they're not going to talk about. And that's been almost 15 years, and the science still has not. What they have talked about is try to answer that damn question. Why are there so many diverse orca cultures around the world? What's going on? All this diversity. So here is this very esteemed set of authors that wrote this paper to explain reproductive isolation, which is the same thing. Is it ecological speciation? And they say the speciation, they speculate, as a result of dietary specialization. So the dietary specializations came first, and that led to a completely different lifestyle that then built into these elaborate cultures with the whole acoustic communication systems and all the other behavioral specifics to each culture. And so that's sort of their theory. But they do forthrightly point out that they can't exclude the possibility that cultural divergence predates ecological divergence. So they're opening that door, but the whole paper is about it's ecological first. And then that was 2012. Here's 2015. Geographic and temporal dynamics in global radiation and diversification of the killer whale. Try to answer the same question. They've got a little different answer, but also a huge list of cetologists behind that. So this is the new consensus. Rather than read that whole abstract, our data suggests it is glacial cycles that did it as a mechanism for driving ecological diversification, which then results in cultural diversification and everything that we see today. So they're still putting that driving force, that factor that makes the cultures we see today originate with an ecological situation. In this case, it's glaciers. So, which is it? It's really, hard to sort of wrap your head around that it may be that culture just comes first. Culture is creative. Culture is defining yourself. Culture is determining your social network, your family, your community, and keeping it that way and developing your particular ways of life. And of course it has to be within the parameters of the ecosystem. You have to feed yourself. You have to have, well, orcas don't really need a whole lot in terms of protection, but they have to answer those essential questions. And so they do within their self-prescribed rules. And so they come up with all these different dietary specializations and everything else. So just to sort of ponder some of the implications and aspects of that, they have the big brain, they rely on, oops, get back, get back, get back. Oh, there we go. Okay, one back. Oh, there we go. Hot buttons. They make many, cultural specific sounds. I would call them languages. I did in a movie a couple of years ago. I think they are the equivalent of languages. And they act according to meanings, beliefs, traditions. I think that I think so. I think the whole perspective sort of adds up. There are so many component parts, so many lines of evidence that add up that it's similar. They are like humans, even more than Rendell and Whitehead wrote in 2001 when they wrote Culture in Whales and Dolphins. Almost no hostilities. And we know there's the exception that we know about, which was when J-Pod beat up 3 transients in a bay just south of Nanaimo in '92, I think it was. So it's not that they can't, but they almost never show any kind of hostilities or any, like dominance jousting for alpha male or female or for mating rights or any of that stuff that almost every other big mammal does. Even sperm whales that have brains much bigger than orcas, they butt heads sometimes. So you just almost never see that. And yet it's not like they are genetically incapable of it. It's like there's a rule against it. There is a tradition. There is a sense of orcas like us in our family don't do that. And so they live accordingly, because that's what grandma says. And every grandma before her for thousands of generations. Small global population, I've kind of wondered about that. I mean, the estimates are not firm. It used to be several 100,000, but those were pretty much based on Soviet estimates when they were trying to kill as many as they could. And the largest populations seem to be in the Antarctic, and I think it's a type B pack ice that are in amongst the Bergibits, the pack ice. So they're pretty hard to get to and count to get any photo documented, demographic picture of how many there are. So it's pretty much estimates. But when you add up all of the sort of reliable estimates around the world, North Pacific, North Atlantic, South Pacific, and Antarctic, I don't think you get more than 20,000, maybe 30,000. And I mean, I'm guessing below what is the consensus in the field, I realize that. But even if it's 30 or up to maybe 50,000, like some say, that's still a very small population for an animal that is so cosmopolitan. They can go in any part of any ocean, deep water, shallow, warm water, cold. They can adapt to live anywhere, have no predators at all to control their population. They could be omnivores and eat everything out there. They could, and maybe they did, way back in their evolutionary history, 8 million years ago. Maybe some of their populations just reproduced and crashed. And maybe they learned. I'm only guessing. But there seems to be a conscious rule now to limit their population size, whether that's by, mating prohibitions, or maybe there's some conscious control over, getting pregnant. So, I can't rule that out either. They do control a lot of their bodily functions, so maybe that's another one. But at any rate, there seems to be a very low birth rate. And they don't attack humans. That's a pretty strange value, but they don't. I don't know why. And they apportion resources. That was something that Mike Big used to sort of joke about, but half serious, that it seems like residents and transients must have a treaty, some kind of agreement to not get in each other's way, to eat completely different prey sources so that they won't have to fight over or compete in any way for food. So that seems to sort of be the case around the world. Even with the multiple types around the Antarctic, they each eat a different diet, so they don't compete for the same food. Yeah, John?
Is there a universal in terms of the social structure? I mean, I know transients have smaller pods, they travel in smaller groups, but just in terms of social structure and you mentioned grandmothers and
Yeah.
the education through those generations. Do we know enough to know whether there's some universal there? I mean, that's society for them, right?
My understanding is it's pretty much matrilineal everywhere you look. And I think that would be the universal. I don't know, did Ken, Giles, anybody have any more about, a universal family structure or social structure? That seems to be, and that doesn't mean, lifetime cohesion for all types. It does for southern residents, but not for transients, although I don't think they lose touch completely. They just go somewhere else for a while. But, they can find each other. It's not that big of an ocean for an orca, apparently. So that's about it. Back to her, though. You really have to wonder how she perseveres with all this. If she knows who she is, how does she keep that fresh and vivid in her mind for 45 years of nothing, of just bare walls and dominance and coercion and control, and not enough room to get any healthy exercise? I don't know how she manages, but somehow still does. So let's see, I don't even know if it's possible. No, it probably isn't. I tried it with this format. Anyway, I've got some JPod calls, but you've all heard JPod calls. So I'll leave it at that. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try.